This embroidery scene in Bridgerton was caused by the Vikings, or more specifically, the Viking mystical practice of satyr. Viking society was strictly gendered. As a patriarchal warrior society, manliness for men was incredibly important. Which is not to say they had the exact same gender norms that we do, they just strictly enforced their own. Weaving and spinning had strong connotations of female reproductive power and female sexuality, similar to Shakti in the Hindu tradition. Textile creation was closely linked to Viking beliefs around fate, destiny, life, and death. We see the Valkyries weaving the entrails of the slain on a loom in one of the sagas. The Norns were goddesses of fate that literally spun and cut the threads of mortal lives. To the Vikings, spinning and weaving were closely associated with the spiritual practice of satyr. Satyr is sometimes called Viking magic or Viking sorcery, but it is the Viking mystic tradition. It had ecstatic rituals and some shamanistic aspects. However you want to describe it, satyr was strictly for women only. It was extremely taboo for men to engage in it. A notable exception to this was Odin, who seems to embody a lot of Viking masculine ideals. He was depicted as being cunning and virile, a great warrior, a great poet, but also as a master of satyr. Some scholars think maybe he was just special because he was a god, or maybe he had the ability to become female like Loki, but we're not really sure. Regardless, for your average Viking man, satyr was not something you ever wanted to be associated with. Iceland provides us with some really cool evidence of this. Prior to Christianity coming to the island, when the belief and practice of satyr were still ongoing, we see spinning and weaving being done in separate outbuildings, even for small rural subsistence farms. How do we know these outbuildings were being used for spinning and weaving? We found spinning and weaving tools in over 70% of them. The general consensus is that these outbuildings were female-only spaces. Medieval Iceland's currency was actually textile-based, so instead of coins, you would have these standardized units of cloth, vadmal, that would be used as currency. Cloth was extremely important to the Icelandic economy, but because of the spiritual belief in satyr, we see men remove themselves from the bulk of the process of textile production. After the conversion of Iceland to Christianity around the year 1000, we see an end to the construction of these separate outbuildings for weaving and spinning. So after Christianity comes to Iceland, spinning and weaving moves into the main house. As with many cultural traditions, a lot of times people do things without knowing why they do things, and Christianized Vikings continued to keep spinning and weaving the exclusive task of women for hundreds of years until the 1700s, when we get factories and industrialization. But during that time, spinning and weaving came to be regarded with something of suspicion by the new Christians because of the old associations with satyr and pre-Christian heathen beliefs. In areas where the Vikings had settled and then become Christianized, like in Britain, there was almost this stigma around the fiber arts, spinning, weaving, sewing, embroidery. Instead of being something that women did because they were the only ones allowed to do it, into the later medieval period, we start to see it be depicted as something punitive. Something women have to do because they might do naughty things otherwise. And from there, we get this idea that spinning, weaving, sewing, embroidery are tools to oppress women, which in some ways they did become that, but not because of anything inherent to the fiber arts themselves. It's all just cultural context. So yeah, all of that leads to this scene where we have one character who is expressing a genuine excitement and interest in the fiber arts, and another character who's supposed to be more enlightened expressing disdain for it. At least that's the way she comes across to me in this scene. But what I think Eloise is actually resisting, whether she and or the writers are aware of it or not, is not the fiber arts themselves, it is the stigma and sexism that came to be associated with them. So yeah, this scene was caused by Viking magic. If you would like to learn more about Viking textiles and what it can tell us about female power in Viking society, I recommend this book, The Valkyries' Loom by Michèle Hayeur-Smith. It is very concise, but very in-depth. I'll link it below. Until next time.